The warm California evening buzzed with excitement as guests in designer outfits filed into Victoria Blackwood's stunning beachfront mansion. The annual charity gala was in full swing, with soft jazz music floating through the air and waiters weaving between guests with trays of champagne and fancy appetizers. Victoria stood near the grand staircase, wearing a simple but elegant black dress that had cost more than most people's cars. At 45, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of running a successful tech company alongside her late husband. Her dark hair was styled in loose waves, and she wore the pearl necklace James had given her on their last anniversary. Mrs. Blackwood, the new healthcare initiative is absolutely brilliant, an older board member was saying, but Victoria had stopped listening. Her eyes were fixed on something, or rather, someone, across the crowded room. Time seemed to slow down. The champagne glass she'd been holding slipped from her fingers, hitting the marble floor with a crash that drew several startled looks. But Victoria didn't notice. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the man standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, chatting with a small group of investors. He was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, one hand casually tucked in his pocket, just like James used to stand. His profile, the way he tilted his head back slightly when he laughed, even the slight crinkles around his eyes. It was all exactly like her husband. For a moment, Victoria forgot how to breathe. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you all right?" The board member touched her arm gently, concern written across his face. A waiter had already hurried over to clean up the broken glass. Yes, I'm fine," Victoria managed to say, though her voice shook slightly. "Who is that man by the windows?" The board member followed her gaze. "Oh, that's Thomas Chen. Brilliant young fellow. He's made quite a name for himself in real estate development. First time at one of our events, I believe." Victoria's hands trembled as she accepted a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter. 3 years. It had been 3 years since she'd lost James in that terrible crash, and she'd learned to live with the grief. She'd thrown herself into running the company, into raising their children, into making sure his legacy lived on through their charitable foundation. But now, staring at this stranger who could have been James's twin, she felt like she was losing him all over again. She watched as Thomas Chen moved through the crowd, stopping occasionally to shake hands or share a joke. Every gesture, every movement was hauntingly familiar. Even from across the room, she could see he had the same warm brown eyes that had made her fall in love with James 20 years ago. "Would you like me to introduce you?" the board member offered, mistaking her intense stare for business interest. "No," Victoria said quickly, too quickly. "No, thank you. I need some air." She made her way to the terrace, her heels clicking against the marble floors. The cool ocean breeze helped clear her head a little, but her mind was racing. It wasn't possible. The resemblance was too perfect, too exact. There had to be an explanation. Standing there under the stars, with the sound of waves crashing against the beach below, Victoria pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over her private investigator's number. The same one she used to vet potential business partners for years. She knew it was crazy. She knew she should just go back inside, smile, and pretend she hadn't seen a ghost in a navy suit. Instead, she pressed dial. Because in all her years in business, Victoria had learned one thing. There was no such thing as coincidence. The morning after the gala, Victoria sat in her home office, staring at her laptop screen. Her perfectly organized desk was now covered with scattered papers, preliminary reports from her private investigator, Michael. Dark circles under her eyes revealed she'd barely slept, her mind replaying the previous night's events over and over. "Mrs. Blackwood," Michael's voice crackled through the speakerphone. "I've got the initial background check on Thomas Chen. Born in Connecticut, graduated from Cornell, built his real estate company from scratch over the last decade. Everything looks surprisingly normal." Victoria rubbed her temples, fighting off a headache. "Connecticut? Which part?" "Small town called River's Edge. Michael paused. Wait, isn't that where your late husband grew up? Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out James's old photo album. Flipping through the yellowed pages, she found what she was looking for: a faded photograph of a teenage James standing in front of River's Edge High School. Michael, I need you to dig deeper. School records, hospital records, anything you can find. There has to be a connection we're missing. She spent the next few hours going through old boxes of James's belongings, something she hadn't done since his death. Each item brought back memories: his favorite blue sweater that still smelled faintly of his cologne, old birthday cards he'd written her, their children's drawings he'd kept in his office. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter. Mom, are you okay? You seemed weird at the gala last night. Victoria stared at the message, unsure how to explain what she was feeling. How could she tell her children that she'd seen someone who looked exactly like their father? Later that afternoon, Michael sent over more detailed reports. Thomas Chen had been adopted as a baby, his early records sealed. He'd grown up with loving parents, worked his way through college, and built a successful business. But the timing nagged at Victoria. Thomas had lived in River's Edge years after James's family had moved away. She opened her laptop and found herself looking at Thomas's company website. There he was, in a professional headshot, smiling that familiar smile. The same dimple in his left cheek, the same slight tilt of his head. Victoria zoomed in on the photo until it pixelated, studying every detail. Her hand shaking slightly, she pulled up an old photo of James at about the same age. Placing the images side by side, the resemblance was uncanny. It went beyond mere similarity. They could have been the same person. Mrs. Blackwood, Michael called again. I found something interesting in the town records. There was a small private hospital in River's Edge that closed down in the late 70s. They had some irregularities in their adoption procedures. Victoria's throat felt dry. What kind of irregularities? Missing records, inconsistent paperwork. Nothing was ever proven, but there were rumors about mixed-up babies, separated siblings. Victoria thought about James, about how he'd never known much about his birth family. His parents had told him he was adopted when he was young, but they hadn't had many details to share. Could it be possible? She picked up her phone and dialed her longtime family lawyer. Richard, I need you to help me unseal some adoption records. And I need you to be discreet about it. As she hung up, Victoria walked to her window, looking out at the ocean beyond her garden. The waves crashed steadily against the shore, a rhythm that usually calmed her. But today, her mind was racing with possibilities. If there was even a chance that Thomas was connected to James, she had to know. She thought about reaching out to Thomas directly but stopped herself. She needed more proof first. After all, she was Victoria Blackwood. She hadn't built an empire by rushing in without a plan. Opening her calendar, she marked off the next few weeks. Finding the truth about Thomas Chen had just become her top priority, even if it meant reopening old wounds she thought had long since healed. The Blue Pearl restaurant sparkled with elegant chandeliers and soft candlelight. Victoria sat at a corner table, her fingers nervously tapping against her water glass. She'd chosen this spot carefully, private enough for a meaningful conversation, but public enough to keep things professional. Through her business connections, she'd arranged what appeared to be a casual meeting about potential real estate investments. Her heart nearly stopped when Thomas Chen walked through the door, guided by the maitre d'. In the warm lighting, the resemblance to James was even more striking. Mrs. Blackwood, Thomas said, extending his hand. It's a pleasure to meet you properly. I didn't get the chance to introduce myself at your gala last week. His voice was different from James's, slightly deeper with a hint of an East Coast accent. Victoria found this oddly comforting as she shook his hand. Please call me Victoria. Thank you for making time to meet. As they settled into their seats, Victoria couldn't help but notice how Thomas pulled his chair in with the same slight adjustment James always had. The waiter appeared with menus, and Victoria watched in amazement as Thomas immediately flipped to the steak section, just as James would have done. "I hear your company is looking to expand into commercial properties," Thomas said, stirring his coffee with a counterclockwise motion, exactly like James used to do. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. "Yes, we're exploring some possibilities," she managed to say, trying to keep her voice steady. "But first, tell me about yourself. I understand you grew up in Connecticut." Thomas's face lit up with a familiar warmth. "River's Edge, yes. Small town, but it gave me my start. My parents, my adoptive parents, still live there." Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water. "Adoptive parents?" "Oh yes," Thomas said casually. "They were always open with me about it. Best people in the world. Supported me through every crazy dream, including starting my own company." The waiter returned to take their orders. Without hesitation, Thomas asked for a rare steak, James's standard order. Victoria felt lightheaded. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked, showing genuine concern. "You look a bit pale." "I'm fine," Victoria said quickly. You remind me of someone." Thomas smiled politely, clearly used to such comments. "I get that a lot, actually. Must have one of those familiar faces." Throughout the meal, Victoria noticed more similarities. The way he cut his food into precise bites, how he would pause briefly before answering questions, even the slight tilt of his head when he was thinking deeply. Each mannerism was like watching a ghost perform a familiar dance. "Your work with sustainable building practices is impressive," Victoria said, steering the conversation back to business. But her mind was racing, thinking about the adoption records her lawyer was trying to unseal. "That's kind of you to say," Thomas replied, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. "The same corner-first way James always had. Though I'm sure you didn't invite me here just to discuss green architecture." Victoria looked at him sharply, but his expression was open, curious. There was no hint that he suspected anything unusual about their meeting. "Actually," she said carefully, "I have a rather personal question, if you don't mind. Have you ever looked into your birth family?" The question seemed to catch Thomas off guard. His confident smile faltered slightly. "I've thought about it," he admitted. "But my parents, the ones who raised me, they're my family. I never felt the need to dig deeper." He paused, studying her face. "Why do you ask?" Victoria's throat felt tight. How could she tell this stranger that he might be connected to her late husband? That every movement he made was like watching a recording of James brought to life. "Just curious," she said softly. "Life has a way of creating unexpected connections." As they finished their meal, Victoria knew she couldn't reveal her suspicions. Not yet. She needed more proof. But watching Thomas sign the check with that familiar flourish, she was more convinced than ever that this was no coincidence. "We should do this again," Thomas said as they prepared to leave. "I have a feeling we could work well together." Victoria smiled, thinking how he had no idea just how connected they might already be. "Yes," she said, "I believe we could." The stack of papers landed on Victoria's desk with a heavy thud. Her private investigator, Michael, stood before her with an expression that told her he found something big. The morning sun streamed through the office windows, casting long shadows across the room. "You might want to sit down for this," Michael said, pulling out a yellowed hospital document from the pile. "Remember that private hospital in River's Edge we were looking into? Well, I found something that's going to change everything." Victoria's hands shook as she took the paper. It was a birth record from 48 years ago, showing that a mother had given birth to identical twin boys. But what caught her eye was the date, the exact same day James was born. "Keep reading," Michael urged, pointing to the notes section. Victoria's eyes widened as she scanned the handwritten remarks. One baby had been immediately adopted by a local family, James's parents. The other infant was meant to go to a family in another state, but there was confusion at the hospital. In the chaos of multiple births that day, the twins were separated. The second baby, listed only as Baby Boy Chen, was given to a different family. "This can't be real," Victoria whispered, but the evidence was right in front of her. More documents showed a pattern of mishandled adoptions at the hospital during that period. Several families had filed complaints about missing information, but the hospital had closed down before any formal investigation could take place. Victoria stood up and walked to the window, needing a moment to process everything. All those years, James had never known he had a twin brother. And now, that twin had walked right into her charity gala, looking exactly like the man she'd lost. "There's more," Michael said gently. "I found Thomas's adoption records. The timestamps, the location, everything matches. He was the other baby." Victoria sank back into her chair, memories flooding her mind. She thought about all the times James had mentioned feeling like something was missing in his life, how he'd sometimes wake up from dreams about having a brother. They'd always brushed it off, but now, her phone buzzed. A text from Thomas about a potential business collaboration. The message sat there, innocent yet now loaded with so much meaning. How could she tell them? Should she tell him? "Mrs. Blackwood." Michael's voice brought her back to the present. "What do you want to do with this information?" Victoria stared at the documents spread across her desk. Medical records, birth certificates, adoption papers, pieces of a puzzle that had taken 48 years to come together. She thought about her children, how they might react to learning they had an uncle they never knew about. "We need to be absolutely certain," she said finally. "Can we get DNA testing done somehow?" Michael nodded. "Actually, I have an idea about that. Thomas's company is bidding on a development project. They'll need environmental impact studies, soil samples, and we could offer to partner with them," Victoria finished, understanding where he was going. "Get close enough to obtain a DNA sample ethically." But as she looked at Thomas's photo clipped to the file, she knew she couldn't play games with something this important. This wasn't just about business or satisfying her curiosity. This was about family, about a truth that had been buried for almost half a century. She picked up her phone and started typing a message to Thomas. "There's something important I need to discuss with you. It's not about business. Would you be willing to meet?" Her finger hovered over the send button. Once she shared this information, there would be no going back. It would change not just her life, but Thomas as well. Was it fair to disrupt his world with this revelation? Then she thought about James, about how he'd always wondered about his birth family. She thought about the right everyone has to know their own story. Taking a deep breath, she pressed send. The response came almost immediately. "Of course. Is everything okay?" Victoria looked at the hospital records one more time, then replied, "Yes, but I have something to tell you about your brother." Victoria's private office at her beachfront home felt too small, too warm, despite the ocean breeze drifting through the open windows. Thomas sat across from her, his face pale as he looked through the hospital documents spread across the coffee table between them. "A twin brother." His voice was barely above a whisper. "And you're saying it was James, your husband?" He picked up an old photograph of James at their wedding, studying it with trembling hands. "I know it sounds impossible," Victoria said gently, "but look at these records. The birth dates, the hospital, the adoption mix-up, and then there's the obvious physical resemblance." Thomas ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture so like James that Victoria had to look away for a moment. This is a lot to take in," he said. "I mean, I always knew I was adopted, but this—" "I understand if you need time to process this," Victoria said, "but there is a way we can know for sure." She pulled out a small box from her desk drawer. "This is a DNA testing kit. I still have some of James's personal items, if you're willing." Thomas stared at the box for what felt like an eternity. Outside, waves crashed against the shore in a steady rhythm, filling the heavy silence. Finally, he reached for it. "Let's do it," he said firmly. "I need to know." The next 2 weeks were the longest of Victoria's life. She threw herself into work, trying not to think about the test results that would either confirm her suspicions or leave her with more questions than answers. Then one morning, her phone rang. It was the private laboratory she'd hired. Victoria's heart pounded as she answered. "Mrs. Blackwood," the lab technician said, "we have the results." The confirmation was clear. Thomas and James were identical twins, separated at birth. The DNA match was undeniable. Victoria sat at her desk, tears rolling down her cheeks as she read through the detailed report. She called Thomas immediately. "Can you come over? The results are in." He arrived within an hour, looking as nervous as she felt. They sat in the same spots as before, but this time, Victoria simply handed him the lab report. Thomas read it slowly, his hand shaking more with each page. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "So it's true. I had a brother, a twin brother, and I never knew." His voice cracked. "And now he's gone, and I'll never get to meet him." Victoria reached across the table and took his hand. "But you can know him through us, through me, through his children, through all the lives he touched. You're part of our family story, Thomas. You always were, we just didn't know it." "His children," Thomas said suddenly, looking alarmed. "Your kids, my nieces and nephews, how do they feel about this?" Victoria squeezed his hand. "I haven't told them yet. I wanted to be sure first. But they're good people, Thomas, just like their father." Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the ocean, just as James used to do when he needed to think. "It's strange," he said softly. "All my life, I've had this feeling that something was missing, like there was a hole I couldn't explain. Now I know why." Victoria joined him at the window. James felt it too. He used to talk about dreams he had about having a brother. Somehow, even without knowing, you were both connected. Thomas turned to her, his eyes full of questions. "Will you tell me about him? Everything. I want to know who my brother was." Victoria smiled through her tears. "Of course. But first, would you like to see some more photos? I have albums full of them, and each one has a story." As they sat down with the first photo album, Victoria felt a weight lift from her heart. She couldn't bring James back, but she could help his brother know who he was. And maybe, in sharing these memories, they could both find a kind of healing they never expected. The family room of Victoria's mansion had never felt so tense. Her children, Robert and Lisa, sat across from her, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief as they processed what she'd just told them. The DNA test results lay on the coffee table between them, untouched. "So this man, this stranger, is suddenly our uncle." Robert, the older of the two at 28, stood up and began pacing. "And you didn't think to consult us before getting involved in all this." Lisa, 25, and usually the calmer one, sat perfectly still, staring at an old photo of their father. "He looks exactly like Dad," she whispered. "It's almost scary." "That's exactly why we need to be careful," Robert snapped. "Mom, how do you know this isn't some elaborate scheme? He shows up looking like Dad, with some convenient story about being his long-lost twin." Victoria kept her voice steady. "I've shown you all the evidence, the hospital records, the DNA test results." "Documents can be faked," Robert interrupted. "DNA tests can be manipulated. This guy's a real estate developer, right? He probably found out about Dad, about our family, and saw an opportunity." "Robert," Victoria said firmly, "I understand you're upset, but Thomas didn't come looking for us. I'm the one who investigated him. I'm the one who uncovered the truth." Lisa picked up the DNA results with trembling hands. "Have you thought about what this means for Dad's estate? For the company?" Victoria felt her heart sink. "Is that what you think this is about? Money?" "What else could it be?" Robert demanded. "This guy shows up right when our tech division is expanding into real estate development. That's not a coincidence. Thomas has his own successful company," Victoria explained patiently. "He's not interested in your father's money. He just wants to know about his brother. His brother, Lisa repeated softly. Our father. She looked up at Victoria with tears in her eyes. Did Dad ever suspect that he had a twin out there somewhere? Victoria moved to sit beside her daughter. He used to have dreams, sometimes, about having a brother, but he never knew for sure. The adoption records were sealed. Robert stopped pacing and leaned against the fireplace mantel. I'm calling our lawyers. We need to protect ourselves, protect Dad's legacy. You sound just like him right now, Victoria said quietly. Your father always wanted to protect everyone too, but he also believed in doing what was right. Lisa wiped her eyes. What does Thomas want from us? Just to know about his brother, Victoria answered. To understand where he came from. To maybe be part of this family, if we let him. And if we don't want him to be? Robert challenged. Victoria looked at her son sadly. Then you'll be rejecting a part of your father too. Thomas isn't trying to replace him, Robert. He's just trying to understand his own story. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock, James's favorite piece. Finally, Lisa spoke up. I want to meet him, she said quietly. Not as some long-lost uncle or potential threat to our inheritance. Just as someone who might help us understand Dad better. Robert looked at his sister in surprise. Lisa, think about it, Rob, she continued. All those times Dad talked about feeling like something was missing in his life. Maybe this is why. And maybe knowing Thomas could help us too. Victoria watched as her son's shoulders slowly relaxed. He picked up one of the old photos of James and studied it closely. The lawyers still need to look everything over, he said finally. But I guess we could meet him. Once. Victoria felt tears of relief in her eyes. It wasn't perfect acceptance, but it was a start. She knew James would have been proud of their children for taking this first step. Should we invite him for dinner? Lisa suggested hesitantly. Maybe somewhere private, just family. Family. The word hung in the air, its meaning somehow both simpler and more complicated than before. Victoria nodded, hoping that somewhere, James was smiling at how his two worlds were finally coming together. The morning headlines hit like a storm. TC Billionaire CC Titoien Disco Vord. Victoria's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications as news outlets across the country picked up the story. Somehow, the private family matter had become very public. Outside her gates, news vans lined the street. Reporters clutched their microphones, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the billionaire widow or the long-lost twin brother. Victoria watched from her security cameras as they interviewed random neighbors, desperate for any scrap of information. Mom, have you seen this? Lisa's voice was panicked on the phone. They're saying Thomas planned this whole thing. They're calling it the twin deception on social media. Victoria sighed, closing her laptop where yet another news article speculated about Thomas's motives. Don't read any of it, sweetheart. They're just trying to create drama where there isn't any. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a message from Thomas. I'm so sorry about all this. I never wanted to cause problems for your family. The media was having a field day with the story. Some outlets painted Thomas as a calculating imposter, while others spun romantic tales about destiny bringing him into Victoria's life. None of them came close to the truth, the simple story of a family discovering its missing piece. Robert burst into her office, waving his phone. They're outside my office too. How did they even find out about this? Victoria had a pretty good idea. One of the lab technicians who handled the DNA test had probably sold the information. Money had a way of making people forget about confidentiality agreements. We need to make a statement, Robert insisted. Set the record straight before these rumors get worse. But before Victoria could respond, her assistant rushed in. Mrs. Blackwood, you need to see this. Thomas is live on Channel 8 News. They turned on the TV to see Thomas standing outside his company building, surrounded by reporters. His face, so much like James's, looked tired but determined. Yes, "The DNA test confirms that James Blackwood was my twin brother," he was saying. "No, I didn't know about this until recently. And no, I'm not interested in any part of the Blackwood fortune. I have my own successful business. All I want is to learn about the brother I never got to meet." Victoria felt tears in her eyes. Even under pressure, he showed the same quiet dignity James always had. Her phone rang again. This time, it was her lawyer. "The press is requesting official statements from everyone. They're digging into old hospital records, trying to find other separated twins. This story is getting bigger by the minute." Victoria watched as social media exploded with opinions. Some people called it a real-life fairy tale, others a sophisticated con job. Celebrity twins were weighing in. Adoption rights groups were calling for investigations into the old hospital's practices, and morning talk shows were booking experts to discuss separated-at-birth phenomena. "I can't do this," Thomas texted later that evening. "Maybe it would be better if I just disappeared for a while. Let things calm down." Victoria felt her heart sink, just when her children were starting to accept him, just when they were beginning to feel like a real family. The media circus threatened to drive him away. She looked at an old photo of James on her desk, remembering how he always faced challenges head-on. Making a decision, she picked up her phone and typed, "Don't you dare disappear. Your family now. We face this together." Then she called her PR team. If the media wanted a story, she would give them one. But on her terms, not a scandal or a sensation, but the truth about two brothers separated by circumstance and reunited through fate, even if one of them was no longer here to see it. "Set up a press conference," she told her assistant. "It's time we took control of this narrative. And call Thomas. He should be there too. It's time the world saw us as what we are, a family." As she hung up, Victoria noticed her hands were steady for the first time all day. The truth would come out, one way or another. Better it come from them, with dignity and grace, just as James would have wanted. The attic of the Blackwood mansion hadn't been properly sorted since James's death. Victoria stood among dusty boxes and old furniture, searching through James's personal belongings. The media circus had finally started to die down, but Thomas had grown distant, overwhelmed by the attention, and Robert's lingering suspicion. "Mom," Lisa called from the attic entrance. "What are you doing up here?" Victoria wiped dust from an old leather briefcase, James's favorite. "Just looking through some of your father's things. I thought maybe we could share some of these with Thomas, help him know his brother better." Lisa climbed up and sat beside her mother on an old trunk. Together, they opened the briefcase, finding it stuffed with papers, old business cards, and family photos. "Look at this," Lisa smiled, pulling out a picture. "Dad at my 5th grade science fair. Remember how he stayed up all night, helping me with that volcano project?" Victoria laughed softly, but then something caught her eye. A sealed envelope at the bottom of the briefcase, marked with the logo of an adoption agency. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. "What is it?" Lisa asked, noticing her mother's expression. Victoria carefully opened the envelope, its seal brittle with age. Inside was a letter dated just 3 weeks before James's fatal accident. As she read, her breath caught in her throat. "Dear Mr. Blackwood," she read aloud, "following your inquiry about your birth family, we have located some preliminary information that may be of interest. Our records indicate the possibility of a twin birth." Lisa grabbed her mother's arm. "Dad was looking for his birth family. He never told us." Victoria continued reading, her voice shaking. "While many records from the River's Edge Private Hospital remain sealed, we have found documentation suggesting you may have a living sibling. If you wish to pursue this matter further." The letter went on to detail the next steps James would have needed to take, steps he never got the chance to complete. Victoria sat back against a dusty chest, overwhelmed by the discovery. "He knew," she whispered, or at least he suspected. Those dreams he used to have about a brother. He was trying to find out if they meant something. Lisa pulled out her phone. "We have to tell Rob about this. And Thomas, he needs to see this letter." Victoria nodded, still staring at the paper in her hands. All those times James had seemed distracted in his final weeks, all those mysterious phone calls. He'd been searching for his brother, never knowing how close he would come to finding him. Within an hour, Robert arrived, bursting into the attic with his usual energy. But when he saw the letter, his skeptical expression melted. "This is Dad's signature," he said quietly, examining the inquiry form attached to the letter. He really was looking for answers. Victoria watched her son's face carefully. "Does this change how you feel about Thomas?" Robert was silent for a long moment. "Dad wanted to know him," he said finally. "Dad was looking for him. That means Thomas really is family." Victoria pulled both her children close, remembering how James always said family was life's greatest gift. "Should we call Thomas? Show him what we found?" "No," Robert said, surprising them both. "Let's do more than that. Let's fulfill Dad's last wish. Let's really make Thomas part of this family." Lisa wiped tears from her eyes. "What do you mean?" "Dad missed out on knowing his brother," Robert explained, his voice growing stronger. "But his children don't have to miss out on knowing their uncle. Let's do this right. A proper family dinner, sharing these old photos, telling stories about Dad. Everything Thomas should have been part of all along." Victoria felt pride swell in her chest. This was the son she knew, the one who had his father's heart. She pulled out her phone and dialed Thomas's number. "Thomas, we found something in the attic that you need to see. Something that proves you were meant to be part of this family all along. Can you come over?" His response was immediate. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." Victoria looked at her children, then back at the letter that had finally bridged the gap between doubt and acceptance. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest gifts come wrapped in the simplest packages, like an unopened letter in an old briefcase, waiting to heal a family's wounds. 1 year later, Victoria's beachfront mansion was filled with warmth and laughter. The formal dining room had been transformed for a special Sunday dinner, now a monthly tradition in the Blackwood family. Thomas sat at the table, showing Lisa's young daughter how to fold her napkin into a swan, just as James used to do. Uncle Thomas, do the trick with the disappearing coin again. The little girl squealed with delight. Victoria watched from the doorway, her heart full at how naturally that word, uncle, now flowed from her grandchild's lips. Robert entered carrying a bottle of wine, his earlier suspicions long forgotten. "Found it, Mom. Dad's favorite vintage, the one he saved for special occasions." The past year had brought changes no one could have predicted. The media storm had eventually died down, replaced by a quieter, more meaningful story. Thomas had become a regular presence in their lives, filling a space they hadn't even known was empty. "Everyone, take your seats," Victoria called out, bringing in the last dish. "The roast will get cold." As they settled around the table, Victoria looked at the faces of her family. Robert, now more relaxed and open than she'd seen him in years. Lisa, who had found in Thomas a confidant and friend. And Thomas himself, who carried pieces of James in every smile, every gesture, yet had become dear to them in his own unique way. "Before we eat," Thomas said, standing up with a glass in his hand, "I'd like to say something." He pulled out a worn photograph from his pocket. One of James at the same age he was now. "A year ago, I discovered I had a brother. Though I never got to meet him, through all of you, I've come to know him." Victoria felt tears welling up as Thomas continued. "I've learned that he was a man who loved deeply, worked hard, and always put family first. I've learned that he had a terrible sense of humor." This brought chuckles from around the table, and that he could never remember to put the cap back on the toothpaste. Robert raised his glass. "That's Dad, all right. But most importantly," Thomas said, his voice growing soft, "I've learned that family isn't just about blood or DNA tests. It's about the stories we share, the traditions we build, and the love we choose to give." Lisa reached over and squeezed his hand. "And you're stuck with us now, Uncle Thomas." Victoria stood up, her own glass raised. "To James," she said, "who brought us all together, even after he was gone." "To James," everyone echoed. After dinner, as the family moved to the patio to watch the sunset, another tradition James had loved, Victoria found Thomas standing by the fireplace, looking at the family photos on the mantel. Among them now stood a new addition, a picture from that first DNA test day, when they discovered the truth. "Thank you," she said softly, joining him. "For what?" "For being patient with us, for giving Robert time to accept you, for sharing yourself with this family." Thomas smiled, that familiar smile that still made her heart skip sometimes. "You know, I used to think success was about building things, making my mark on the world. But this past year has taught me that real success is about the connections we make, the love we share." Outside, they could hear Robert and Lisa laughing, their children playing in the garden. The sound of family, exactly what James had always wanted most. "He would have loved this," Victoria said. "All of us together. I think he knows," Thomas replied, touching the old photo of his brother. "Somehow, I think he's been here all along, making sure we found each other." As the California sun set over the ocean, casting golden light through the windows, Victoria looked at her expanded family and felt complete. The story that had begun with a shocking resemblance at a charity gala had become something beautiful, a testimony to the power of love, acceptance, and the unbreakable bonds of family. James had always said that everything happens for a reason. Looking at her children, her grandchildren, and the brother-in-law who had become so dear to them all, Victoria finally understood what he meant. Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places, and the best stories don't end with goodbye, but with a new beginning.